They say the truth always finds a way to breathe, but sometimes it waits until the very last second to be heard. The hallway outside the execution chamber was colder than Daniel Hayes remembered, a kind of quiet that pressed against the ears like deep water. Each step of the guard echoed slow and measured boots against polished concrete, as if time itself had learned to walk carefully. Here, Daniel sat with his hands resting loosely in his lap, not shaking, not resisting, just still the way soldiers become after they have run out of things to fight. His eyes traced the thin line of light beneath the door, a pale strip that flickered every time someone passed on the other side. He had once measured danger in seconds and heartbeats in the rhythm of distant machinery. Now he measured it in silence. 27 seconds felt longer than a lifetime. When you knew exactly how it would end, the air carried a faint scent of antiseptic and metal, clean but heavy, like something trying too hard to erase what it could not. The officer standing nearby cleared his throat, not unkindly, just uncertain, as if words did not belong in a place like this. You still have the right to make a final request. Daniel lifted his gaze slowly. His voice, when it came, was quiet, steady, almost gentle. I want to see my dog. For a moment nothing moved, then a glance passed between two guards, a hesitation, small but real, the kind that comes when procedure meets something human. Minutes later the sound came, first a soft clicking of nails against the floor, uneven, then steady, then closer. Daniel's breath caught before he even saw him. Rex stepped through the doorway, a full-grown German shepherd, his coat a blend of ash gray and pale cream, catching the dim overhead light like frost. His ears stood high alert, but it was his eyes that stopped everything, amber sharp, searching, not wild, not confused, just focused. Daniel leaned forward slightly, a reflex older than thought. Rex didn't run, he didn't wag his tail, he didn't make a sound. He stopped just a few feet away and stared as if measuring something unseen. The room shifted, not in movement, but in feeling, the kind that settles deep in the chest before the mind understands it. Daniel whispered, "Hey, partner." The word barely more than breath. Rex's ears twitched, but he did not move closer. Instead, his nose lifted slightly, drawing in the air, slow, deliberate, like he used to do before every mission. Then, without warning, he let out 3 short barks, clean, precise, spaced in a pattern Daniel knew too well, the same signal he had trusted in places where mistakes cost everything. One of the guards frowned. That dog doesn't seem right. But Daniel's heart was already pounding, not from fear, but from recognition. Because Rex never barked like that unless something was there, something hidden, something wrong. And in that moment, as the seconds continued to fall away, Daniel realized maybe the end wasn't what it seemed. Maybe something had been waiting all along, just beneath the surface, listening for the one voice that would never lie. Rex's body remained still, but the tension in him grew visible, like a wire pulled too tight. His ears angled forward, his nose tracing something in the air that no one else could. Since Daniel felt it before he understood it, that old instinct from years in uniform, the kind that whispered when something was out of place. One of the officers stepped closer, lowering his voice, as if trying not to disturb whatever invisible line had been drawn. "He is just nervous, it happens." Daniel shook his head slowly, never breaking eye contact with Rex. "No, he is not nervous, he is working." The word hung there, unfamiliar in this room where nothing was supposed to happen anymore. Rex shifted then, not toward Daniel, but to the side, his paws moving with quiet precision across the floor until he reached the far wall. His nails clicked once, twice, then stopped. He lowered his head, pressing his nose near the seam of a metal panel set into the concrete, the kind no one paid attention to because it had always been there. His tail remained still, not relaxed, not tense, just steady. Then again, 3 short barks, the same pattern, exact spacing, exact purpose. A signal burned into memory from places where hesitation cost lives. Daniel's breath deepened. He could almost hear the past echoing in the room. Desert wind, distant engines, the weight of waiting. "Trust him," he said softly, but firmly. One of the guards frowned, glancing at the others. "We cannot delay procedure for a dog." Daniel turned his head just enough to meet the man's eyes, his voice calm, but carrying something unshakable. "You trained to follow orders. I trained to stay alive. That dog is telling you something is wrong." The silence that followed felt different, heavier, as if the room itself was listening. Rex stepped back then and pawed at the panel, once a sharp, deliberate motion, then again slower, more insistent. A faint, hollow sound answered beneath the metal, not loud but wrong enough to notice now that someone had pointed it out. The officer hesitated, his hand hovering near his radio, uncertain, caught between protocol and instinct. Daniel watched him, not pleading, not desperate, just certain. Finally, the officer exhaled, and nodded to another guard. Check it. The second guard approached, cautiously kneeling down, his fingers brushing along the edge of the panel. He paused, then pressed harder. The metal shifted slightly, not enough to open, but enough to confirm. It was not sealed the way it should have been. The guard looked up, confusion crossing his face. This was not in the maintenance logs. Rex let out a low sound, not quite a growl, more like a warning carried through his chest. Daniel felt it settle into him, like a memory returning. He had trusted that sound in places where maps failed and logic broke down. The guard reached for a tool from his belt and carefully pried at the edge. The panel lifted just enough to reveal darkness beneath, a narrow space where something had been placed, deliberately hidden, where no one would think to look. The room held its breath as the guard reached inside slowly, carefully, and when his hand came back out, he held something small and unfamiliar, wrapped in material that did not belong to the structure at all. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief second, not in relief, not yet, but in recognition, because whatever lay in that guard's hand had been waiting in silence, just like Rex had been waiting to find it. And somewhere beneath the weight of all those lost seconds, the truth had finally begun to move. The object in the guard's hand was smaller than expected, wrapped in a thin layer of dark fabric, worn at the edges, as if it had been hidden for a long time. The room leaned closer, without moving, every eye fixed on that single point of truth. The officer stepped forward, his voice lower, now almost careful. Let me see. That the guard passed it to him, and for a moment he did not open it. He simply held it, weighing something more than its size, as if instinct was catching up to reality. Rex stood still, but his gaze never left the object, his ears slightly tilted forward, his breathing slow, controlled. Daniel watched the same way he had watched Rex in the field, not with curiosity, but with trust. The officer finally unfolded the fabric, revealing a small device no larger than a deck of cards, its surface marked with scratches and a faint serial code etched along the side. But what made the air shift was not the object itself. It was where it should not have been. This does not belong here, one of the guards murmured, almost to himself. The officer nodded slowly, then turned it over, his fingers brushing along a thin seam, before pressing lightly. A soft click answered, and a tiny light flickered once, then went still. No sound followed, just silence, deeper than before. Daniel felt something settle into place inside him, not relief, not yet, but alignment, like a puzzle piece finally finding where it had always belonged. Rex took one step forward, then stopped, his tail lowering slightly, not in fear, but in completion. His job done for now. The officer looked toward Daniel, his expression no longer distant, no longer procedural. Where did you learn that signal? Daniel exhaled slowly, his voice steady from years of repetition. Overseas. That pattern means hidden threat, concealed source, something placed where it should not be. He paused, then added, he never gets it wrong. The officer glanced back at the device, then toward the wall, then around the room, as if seeing it for the first time, not as a fixed space, but as something that could have been altered without notice. How long has this been here? He asked. No one answered, because no one knew, and that uncertainty spread quietly through the room like a draft under a closed door. Another guard shifted uneasily. We sweep this area every week. Nothing like this was ever reported. The officer nodded, but his eyes remained on the device. Sometimes you do not find something because you are not looking for it. Rex let out a soft breath, almost a sigh, and for the first time since entering the room, he turned his head slightly toward Daniel. Their eyes met, and in that brief exchange there was something deeper than command or training. It was recognition. Daniel lowered his voice barely above a whisper. You felt it, did not you? Rex's ears twitched once the officer straightened his posture, his decision forming not out of procedure, but out of something older, something that listened. When logic paused, we are suspending this process, he said firmly, until this is fully investigated. One of the guards hesitated. Sir, the schedule. The officer cut him off without raising his voice. Schedules do not matter if the foundation is wrong. The words settled into the room with quiet authority. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of time shift around him, not gone, not erased, but interrupted, and somewhere beneath the surface of everything that had led him here, a single thought began to rise, clear and undeniable. If this was placed here, then someone had planned it. And if someone had planned it, then the story they believed about him was not the whole truth. Rex stepped closer, now finally reaching Daniel, his nose brushing gently against his hand, warm, steady, real. And in that contact, something returned, not freedom, not yet, but the possibility of it. And sometimes that is where the real change begins. The room did not return to normal because something had already shifted beneath its surface, the kind of shift that does not make noise but changes everything. The officer moved slowly, now no longer following routine, but tracing possibility, his fingers still holding the device, as if it might answer him. If he listened long enough, we need records, he said quietly, not to anyone in particular, but to the truth itself. Who installed this panel? Who last signed off on this room? One of the guards stepped back toward the wall-mounted terminal, his movements less certain than before. The glow of the screen reflected faintly across his face as he began pulling up logs, dates, names, maintenance reports that had once seemed unimportant now carried weight. Daniel remained seated, but his posture had changed, not in defiance, but in awareness, like a man who had been underwater too long and finally felt the surface somewhere above. Rex stayed close, his body angled slightly toward the room, not just Daniel, as if he was still listening, still measuring the unseen. The guard at the terminal frowned. There is a gap, he said, his voice low. 2 weeks, no entries, no inspections. The officer stepped closer. Show me. The screen flickered as the data scrolled lines of routine checks. Then nothing, then entries resumed again, as if those missing days had never existed. That is not possible, the officer murmured. Every system logs automatically, unless someone interrupts it, unless someone knows how. Daniel added, his voice calm, but carrying a quiet certainty, the kind that comes from years of watching patterns break. Rex lifted his head slightly, his ears twitching, not toward the panel this time, but toward the door. A subtle shift, almost missed, but Daniel saw it. He always did. Someone is coming, he said softly. The officer turned instinctively, just as the handle moved. The door opened and another figure stepped, in uniform, crisp posture, controlled, but something in his presence felt too deliberate, like a man who had already decided how things should look before he entered. What is going on here? He asked, his tone measured, but edged with impatience. The officer held up the device. We found something in the wall, something that should not be here. The man's eyes flickered to it, just for a fraction of a second, too fast for most, but not for Daniel, and not for Rex. The dog stiffened instantly, a low sound building in his chest, not aggressive, but certain. Daniel's gaze sharpened. He had seen that look in Rex before, not fear, not confusion, recognition. The officer noticed it too. Your dog seems to know him, he said quietly. Daniel did not answer right away. He was watching the man, now the way a tracker watches a trail, not what was visible, but what did not fit. The man took a step forward, his expression smoothing over whatever had slipped earlier. I suggest we proceed with the scheduled process, he said calmly, whatever that is can be reviewed later. The officer did not move. Later might be too late, he replied, and for the first time there was a line drawn between them, not loud, not dramatic, but clear. Rex stepped forward, placing himself slightly between Daniel and the man, his stance firm, his eyes locked. Daniel felt the past rise up around him like a memory unfolding, not in images, but in feeling. The same presence, the same silence before something revealed itself. He spoke, then not loudly, but with a certainty that filled the space. He has seen this before. The room seemed to pause around those words, and in that stillness something unseen began to take shape, because sometimes the truth does not arrive all at once. Sometimes it walks in quietly and waits to be recognized. The man's presence lingered in the room like a draft no one could explain, cool and subtle, but impossible to ignore. He stood with practiced ease, hands at his sides, posture steady, yet something in his stillness felt rehearsed, like a performance repeated too many times. Rex did not look away, his body firm, every muscle aligned, not in aggression, but in certainty. The low sound in his chest deepened just enough to be felt more than heard. Daniel's voice came quiet but clear. He knows you. The words did not accuse, they revealed. The man's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted a fraction too late to hide coincidence. He replied smoothly, dogs react to stress. The officer did not respond immediately, his attention moving between Rex, the device, and the man, as if piecing together a pattern that refused to stay hidden. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady on Rex. What is it, boy? Rex took one slow step closer toward the man, then stopped, his nose lifting again, drawing in the air the way he had done moments before at the wall, but this time his focus did not waver. Then it came, 3 short barks followed by a pause, then one more, different from before, sharper, more direct. Daniel felt the recognition settle in his chest. That was not a general alert, that was identification, the same signal Rex had used when marking a specific source in the field, not just something wrong, but someone. The officer's voice lowered. Are you suggesting the dog is pointing at him? Daniel did not blink. He is not suggesting, he is confirming. The silence that followed carried weight, the kind that presses decisions into existence. The man let out a small breath, almost a laugh, controlled, dismissive. "This is absurd. You are delaying a lawful process based on animal behavior." The officer stepped forward slightly, his tone calm, but no longer neutral. "What I see is a trained K9 performing a consistent pattern linked to detection, and I see a device that should not exist in this room. That is not absurd. That is a problem." The man's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Protocol exists for a reason," he said firmly, "and right now you are stepping outside of it." Daniel spoke again, softer now, but somehow more present. "Sometimes protocol misses what loyalty sees." Rex moved then. Not aggressively, but with intention, circling slightly to the side, positioning himself where he could see both Daniel and the man. His ears remained forward, his eyes locked. The room felt smaller, as if the walls had drawn closer to listen. The officer glanced toward the terminal, then back at the man. "Your access level?" He asked, the question simple, but sharp enough to cut through pretense. The man hesitated. "Not long, just enough access to perform my duties," he answered. The officer nodded slowly, then gestured to the guard. "Pull his access logs." The guard's fingers moved quickly across the keys, the screen flickering with lines of data, dates, times, entry points. Daniel watched Rex instead, because the truth was not on the screen, yet it was standing in front of him, breathing, steady, waiting. The guard spoke, his voice tighter than before. "There are entries during the missing window." The officer leaned closer. "Whose credentials?" The guard swallowed, then read the name aloud. And when the sound of it settled into the room, everything aligned, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, like a lock turning that had been resisting for too long. Rex let out a quiet breath, his body easing just slightly, as if the answer he had been holding was no longer his alone. And in that moment, Daniel understood something deeper than relief. Sometimes the truth does not need to be proven, it only needs to be revealed to the right eyes at the right time. The name echoed in the room with a quiet finality, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, like the last piece of a truth that had been waiting to surface. The guard's voice trembled slightly as he repeated it again, this time slower, as if giving everyone a chance to understand what it meant. The man standing near the door did not move at first, his posture still composed, but the air around him had changed. The confidence that once filled the space now felt thinner, stretched too far. The officer looked up from the terminal, his eyes steady, no longer searching. "But knowing your credentials were used during the missing window," he said calmly. The man exhaled through his nose, a controlled release of breath that carried more weight than words. "Access can be shared," he replied quickly. "Someone could have used my clearance." Daniel watched him carefully, not the words, but the pauses between them, the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his shoulders held just a fraction too rigid. He had seen it before, not in courtrooms, but in quiet moments before something gave way. Rex remained still, his gaze never breaking. The silence grew again, but this time it was not empty, it was full of everything that had been uncovered. The officer stepped closer, holding the device up between them. This was hidden behind a secured panel in a controlled room during a period where records were erased, and your access appears in that gap. He paused just long enough for the weight to settle. "You understand how that looks?" The man's eyes flickered again, this time longer, searching for something to hold on to. "Protocol, you are drawing conclusions without full investigation." The officer nodded slightly. "That is why the process has been stopped." The word stopped carried more force than anything said before, not because it was loud, but because it changed the direction of everything. Daniel felt it, like a shift in gravity, not freedom, not yet, but movement. Rex took a small step back, his body easing, not in surrender, but in completion. His work here was done for now. He had led them to the edge of something, and now it was up to the humans to follow through. The guard at the terminal spoke again. "There is more," he said, his voice steadier now, as if the truth itself was giving him strength. "Additional entries tied to the same credentials and other restricted areas." The officer's gaze sharpened, a pattern, then not a mistake. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, letting the moment settle, not as victory, but as alignment. Everything that had felt wrong now had shape and direction. When he opened them again, he looked at Rex, who had finally turned his head toward him, the dog's amber eyes softer, now no longer searching, just present. Daniel's voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "You stayed with me, even when no one else did." Rex's ears twitched, once a simple answer in a language beyond words. The officer stepped back, slightly giving space, not out of courtesy, but recognition. Something important had shifted here, not just a case, not just a process, but a truth that refused to stay buried. The man near the door said nothing now, his silence no longer controlled, but held like something he could not quite release, and in that silence the room seemed to breathe again, not with fear, not with certainty, but with possibility, because sometimes the moment that was meant to end everything becomes the moment that begins to reveal what was hidden all along. The room no longer felt like a place of endings. It felt like a threshold, something suspended between what had been decided and what was still unfolding. The officer lowered the device slowly, as if it no longer belonged to him, but to the truth it carried. "We are escalating this," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "External review, full audit, everything stops here." The words settled into the space like a quiet command that could not be undone. One of the guards nodded, stepping toward the door, reaching for his radio, his voice low as he called it in, requesting immediate oversight. Daniel listened, but did not move. His attention remained on Rex, who now stood beside him, calm, steady as if the storm had already passed, even though its echoes still lingered in the air. The man near the door shifted his weight for the first time since the name had been spoken. His posture no longer perfectly aligned. There was a fracture, now small, but visible, in the way his hands tightened slightly at his sides. "This is unnecessary," he said, his tone measured but thinner than before. "You are creating doubt where there was certainty." The officer met his gaze directly. "Certainty built on incomplete truth is not certainty, it is assumption, and we do not finalize outcomes on assumptions." The guard at the terminal turned the screen. "Slightly more entries are appearing," he said quietly. "Archived files, cross-references. It looks like the device is not standalone. It links to other records tied to the original case." Daniel felt the words land deep, not as surprise, but as confirmation, like something he had carried without proof, now finally given shape. The officer stepped closer to the screen, reading carefully, his brow tightening just slightly, then relaxing as understanding replaced uncertainty. "This changes everything," he murmured, not loudly, but enough for the room to hear. Rex lifted his head at the shift in tone, his ears tilting forward again, not alert this time, but attentive. Daniel reached down slowly, resting his hand against the dog's neck. The warmth grounded him, not because he needed strength, but because he recognized what had been given to him, something rare, something that could not be trained or taught, only trusted. The officer turned back toward Daniel, his expression no longer distant. "There is a strong possibility that your case was influenced by manipulated evidence," he said. "We cannot proceed until every detail is reviewed." Daniel nodded, once not in relief, not in gratitude, just acknowledgement, the kind that comes from a man who has learned to wait for truth without expecting it. The man near the door exhaled again, this time sharper. "Then you are choosing to dismantle a completed process based on uncertainty," he said. The officer's response came without hesitation. "I am choosing to follow evidence wherever it leads." The silence that followed felt different from before, not heavy, not pressing, but open, like a door that had been locked for too long. Now finally unlatched. Rex stepped forward slightly, his body brushing against Daniel's leg, a quiet reminder of presence, of loyalty, of something that had never wavered. Daniel looked down at him, then back up at the room around him, and for the first time since he had entered, he felt something unfamiliar. Not freedom, not yet, but space for truth to move, space for the story to change, and sometimes that space is where everything begins to turn. Time no longer moved in the same direction it had. Slowed not in seconds, but in weight, each moment carrying more meaning than the one before. The door opened again, but this time the energy that entered was different, quieter, steadier. A small team stepped inside, not hurried, not loud, but precise. Their presence filled the room with something that felt like clarity rather than control. The officer stepped aside, slightly briefing them in low tones, passing the device over carefully, as if handing off something fragile, not because of what it was, but because of what it represented. Daniel watched, without speaking. His world had narrowed to observation, to listening the way it had in places where survival depended on noticing what others missed. Rex remained at his side, calm, grounded, his breathing slow, his body no longer tense, but not relaxed either. He was still working in his own way, just quieter now. One of the investigators knelt near the open panel, examining the space with practiced attention, his gloved fingers tracing the edges, measuring the gap, noting the placement. "This was intentional," he said softly, "not to anyone specific, but to the truth itself. This was not random." The second investigator stood at the terminal, reviewing the logs, cross-referencing data streams. "The missing window is not empty," he said. "It was overwritten. Layered entries placed over original records. Someone knew exactly how to hide activity without deleting it entirely." Daniel felt a slow shift inside him, not a surge, not a reaction, but a steady alignment like something that had always been off now settling into place. The officer folded his arms, watching closely. The device was never meant to be found, he said, more to himself than to the room. It was meant to sit here, silent, supporting a version of events that no one would question. Rex lifted his head slightly, his ears angling toward the investigators, as if confirming what had already been known in his world. Truth did not need explanation, it needed recognition. The man near the door remained still, but the space around him felt different now, not controlled, not contained. The investigator at the panel stood slowly, turning toward him. Your access credentials appear repeatedly in restricted zones during the same time frame as the altered logs, he said, his tone calm, not accusing, just clear. We will need to review your full activity history. The man opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came immediately, and in that small pause something else became visible, not guilt, not fear, but the absence of certainty, the kind that once held everything together. Daniel noticed it the way a soldier notices when the ground beneath him shifts just slightly enough to matter. The officer nodded to the guards. Ensure he remains available for questioning. The phrasing was careful, but the meaning was understood. The man did not resist, he simply stood there, as if the structure around him had changed, and he had not yet decided how to move within it. Rex exhaled softly, his body easing another fraction. His role here complete. Daniel looked down at him, his hand resting lightly against the dog's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of breath. Something returned in that moment, not justice, not yet, but direction. And sometimes direction is what carries a man out of the place where everything once seemed final. The investigator turned back to the officer. This case will need to be reopened, he said quietly. Every piece, every record, every assumption. The officer nodded once, then looked toward Daniel, not as a subject, not as a conclusion, but as a man standing in the middle of a story that had not ended the way it was supposed to. And in that quiet realization, the room no longer felt like a place where something had almost ended. It felt like the beginning of something that had been waiting patiently to be seen. Morning did not arrive all at once. It slipped quietly through a narrow window high on the wall, a thin line of pale light stretching across the floor, where hours earlier everything had seemed final. The room was no longer filled with tension, but with movement, purposeful, steady, the kind that comes when something has shifted beyond return. Daniel stood now not as a man waiting for an end, but as someone suspended in a moment that had not yet decided what it would become. The restraints were gone, the guards no longer positioned as barriers, but as witnesses to something unfolding. Rex stayed close, his body brushing lightly against Daniel's side, not needing command, not needing instruction, just present the way. He had always been. One of the investigators approached, holding a folder not thick, but heavy with implication. His voice calm, measured, the kind that carried truth without needing to raise itself. The case has been formally reopened, he said. New evidence has been verified, inconsistencies confirmed, and additional findings are being reviewed. Daniel listened without interruption, his eyes steady, not searching, not questioning, just receiving the words as they came. The officer, who had first stopped the process, stood nearby, his posture relaxed but attentive, like a man who understood that what had happened here would not be easily forgotten. You will be moved to a holding unit pending full review, he added, not as a warning, but as a step forward. Daniel nodded once, the motion simple, but full of something deeper than acknowledgement. It was acceptance, not of what had been, but of what might now be. Rex looked up at him, his amber eyes soft, reflecting the light that had slowly filled the room. Daniel placed his hand gently on the dog's head, his fingers moving through the thick fur, grounding himself in something that had never changed. You stayed, he said quietly, the words almost lost in the space between them. Rex's tail moved once, a small motion, but enough. Daniel exhaled slowly, feeling something inside him loosen, not break, not disappear, just release the weight that had been held too long. Outside the room, the hallway no longer echoed with final steps, but with quiet conversation, measured voices discussing timelines, procedures, next steps. The world had not changed entirely, but it had shifted enough to matter. The investigator closed the folder and looked at Daniel, not with judgment, not with certainty, but with recognition. This will take time, he said carefully, but time is something you now have. Daniel glanced toward the window again, the light stronger, now no longer a thin line, but a presence filling the space in front of him. Time, he repeated softly, as if the word itself needed to be understood. Again, Rex leaned slightly into his leg, a steady reminder that not everything needed explanation. Some things simply remained. The officer opened the door, gesturing forward, not as an order, But as an invitation, Daniel stepped toward it, his movements slow, not hesitant, just deliberate, each step carrying him away from a place that had once been defined by endings and into something undefined, something uncertain. But open. Rex walked beside him perfectly, in step as he always had, the two of them moving forward without looking back, and as the light followed them into the hallway, it felt less like they were leaving something behind, and more like they were finally stepping into something that had been waiting quietly all along, because sometimes the truth does not arrive to save a life, it arrives to return it.